During World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union teamed up to defeat Hitler, but their uneasy alliance soon ended. This conflict created the Cold War, which resulted in heated competitions such as the space race and the development of the internet. I mean, if you are seeing this video, it's probably because of the Cold War. So, what exactly happened? Let's find out. When Nazi Germany unexpectedly attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, violating their non-aggression deal with Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, the alliance's fragility increased. As a result, the Lend-Lease Act allowed the United States to give the Soviet Union vital support by giving them resources and weaponry to help with their defense. But as soon as Nazi Germany was vanquished, the shaky alliance between the US and the USSR fell apart. Their partnership broke down, and the Cold War began as a result of escalating tensions, especially over post-war concerns such as Poland's destiny. The rising jealousy between the United States and the Soviet Union only grew after World War II, according to a BBC story, which led British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to famously declare in 1946 that an Iron Curtain was descending across Europe. The Cold War officially began with this. The United States and the Soviet Union never participated in open combat during the Cold War, giving rise to the term Cold War as opposed to a hot war involving direct fighting. As per the JFK Presidential Library and Museum, the two superpowers engaged in a constant state of enmity, which was achieved through a combination of political maneuvering, military alliance formation, espionage, propaganda, arsenal building, economic assistance, and sponsorship of proxy wars in foreign countries. This fierce rivalry was evident in several key events in the late 1940s, highlighting the deepening divide between the two sides. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin tried to establish a vast buffer zone between Western Europe and the Soviet Union in the early phases of the Cold War, according to biography.com. As decided upon by Stalin, the United States and Great Britain at the Yalta Conference in 1945, this buffer zone consisted of Eastern European nations that were expected to conduct free elections. But between 1945 and 1948, Stalin implemented communist regimes in these nations, violating the terms of the agreement. US President Harry Truman instituted the containment strategy in reaction to Stalin's actions. According to one educational website, the goal of this approach was to stop the Soviet Union from using force, even if it meant military involvement, to spread its communist philosophy to other nations. Containment led the United States to take various actions, such as launching the Marshall Plan in 1948, which provided economic aid to help Western Europe recover from World War II. Additionally, the US joined forces with Canada and other Western European nations to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance aimed at countering Soviet influence. In response, Stalin initiated his own version of containment, reacting to what he saw as a Western power grab in Germany in 1948. Although he couldn't prevent the US, Great Britain, and France from merging their occupation zones into the new economic entity of West Germany, Stalin found a way to retaliate. He turned Berlin into a pawn, orchestrating the famous Berlin blockade in an attempt to make the Western powers suffer for their actions. The Soviets cut off highway and railroad access between the newly merged Western zones and Berlin, a city deep within Soviet-controlled territory. Like the rest of Germany, Berlin was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. With their supply routes severed, West Berlin's residents faced severe shortages and the threat of starvation. Stalin's blockade put the Western Allies in a difficult position. Giving in to Stalin would make them appear weak, but abandoning Berlin would make them seem heartless. However, they were not willing to start a war over the city. Instead, they chose a different approach, the Berlin airlift. For 324 days, planes delivered roughly 13,000 tons of supplies daily to sustain the people of West Berlin. The airlift was a success, and in 1949, Stalin ended the blockade. The Cold War continued for many more decades, with the US focused on stopping the spread of communism while the Soviet Union aimed to expand it. This led to their involvement in significant conflicts like the Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953, and the Vietnam War, which spanned from the 1950s to the 1970s. In between these two conflicts, a fascinating event took place. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first man-made satellite to orbit the Earth, sparking the start of the space race. This incident stunned Americans and ushered in a period of space exploration competition. The United States reacted by launching Explorer 1 on January 31, 1958, but the Soviets continued to lead in other critical milestones, such as sending the first animal, Laika, into space on November 3, 1957. Also, during the Korean War, the US spent around $67 billion and tragically 36,574 American soldiers lost their lives. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, supported North Korea and its Chinese allies by providing military weapons such as the PPSH-41 submachine guns, T-34-85 tanks, and MiG-15 jet fighters. But what did both superpowers gain from all this investment of money, lives, and military resources? The Korean War ended in a stalemate, leaving North and South Korea divided by a heavily fortified, demilitarized zone with no clear victor. In the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union played a crucial role in helping North Vietnam achieve victory by providing significant arms and economic aid, estimated at $3.6 billion to $8 billion. Backed by the Soviet Union and China, North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong persisted despite heavy losses, using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to regain lost territory. Despite deploying over 2.5 million soldiers, the US faced declining morale and a strong anti-war movement at home, leading to widespread desertions and protests. In 1973, the United States negotiated a peace agreement with North Vietnam aiming to end its involvement in the conflict. However, hostilities persisted between North and South Vietnam until April 30, 1975, when communist forces successfully captured Saigon. This event marked the surrender of South Vietnam and solidified communist control over the entire country, a situation that has remained unchanged since. Around the same time, in 1958, another Cold War crisis was unfolding. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev grew increasingly troubled by West Berlin due to its capitalist economy and the mass exodus of skilled East Germans escaping through the city. This tension set the stage for further conflicts between the superpowers during the Cold War era. Khrushchev wanted to push the United States, Great Britain and France out of West Berlin and turn the city into what one source describes as a free, demilitarized city under Soviet control. When the three countries refused to leave, he sought another solution to the problem of mass migration from East Germany. In response, East Germany constructed the infamous Berlin Wall to halt the exodus of its citizens. Although the US did not intervene to stop the wall's construction, tensions escalated when East German border guards attempted to prevent Allied officials from accessing East Berlin. This led to a tense standoff at Checkpoint Charlie, where US and Soviet tanks faced off for 16 hours. Fortunately, the crisis was diffused through behind-the-scenes negotiations between the US President John Kennedy and Khrushchev, leading to the tanks withdrawing the next day. A year later, Kennedy and Khrushchev faced another tense Cold War standoff, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Khrushchev's intention to station nuclear weapons in Cuba, only 90 miles from the US mainland, did not sit well with Kennedy. He demanded that Khrushchev withdraw the missiles and imposed a naval blockade around Cuba to enforce his demands. Tensions rose as Soviet ships approached the US blockade, causing many to believe the world was on the verge of nuclear conflict. Fortunately, Khrushchev backed down and the Soviet ships stopped short of challenging the blockade. The crisis was resolved through an agreement. Khrushchev would remove the missiles, Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba, and a secret deal ensured the removal of US missiles from Turkey. As many of us know, the internet originated during this Cold War. In the 1960s, the US Department of Defense's Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, launched the ARPANET project. This network was intended to establish a communication system that could withstand a nuclear assault, reflecting the military and strategic concerns of the period. The prospect of nuclear conflict during the Cold Conflict prompted the idea of a decentralized network in which communication might continue even if certain network components were destroyed. After a period of détente, where relations between the US and the Soviet Union improved in the 1970s, Cold War tensions flared up again in the 1980s under US President Ronald Reagan, who adopted a more aggressive stance against the Soviet Union than his predecessors had. To weaken the USSR, Reagan decided to target its most vulnerable point, the economy. The Soviet economy was already struggling, with productivity growth dropping below zero by the early 1980s. Reagan intensified the pressure by dragging the Soviets into an expensive arms race, significantly increasing US military spending. For example, defense spending surged from $214 billion in 1982 to $258 billion in 1983. The Soviet Union could not afford to stay up with the United States, especially as the latter produced new weaponry such as the stealth bomber. The United States also launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a high-tech missile defense system which drove the Soviets to seek a de-escalation of the weapons competition. Along with these military efforts, the United States explored various measures to economically burden the Soviet Union, further weakening its already fragile economy. Reagan's approach for weakening the Soviet Union included isolating it from the world economy and lowering oil prices, which were critical to the Soviet economy. According to Norwich University Online, this strategy was successful. The United States isolated the Soviets from the rest of the world economy and helped drive oil prices to their lowest levels in decades. Without enough oil money, the Soviet economy began to implode. Reagan's policies, along with growing opposition to Soviet rule in Eastern Europe and Gorbachev's reforms of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, accelerated the Soviet Union's downfall. In his iconic 1987 speech at the Berlin Wall, Reagan challenged Gorbachev to tear down this wall. By 1989, people were doing just that, using picks, hammers, and bulldozers. The formal dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the official end of the Cold War. Do you believe the Cold War is truly over? Please let us know in the comments. See you next time.